Forged secretly in mortuary archaeology's hottest furnace, it's Archaeo-death.
There she is. She's on.
Recording in progress. Sorry.
I should leave that in. That's amazing. Ah, that's so great. Anyway,
Look at
and
Fuji-san just sitting there smiling at me, going, "What are you going to say next?" Look at his hat,
holy
his Easter
fucking
bonnet.
shit, it's Howard. How you doing, man?
Hey,
How you
you are,
doing?
yeah,
You
looking
you
very
you, you like an
Eastery.
Easter bonnet?
Um,
Look at this. Check it out.
that's
Look at
very
the got
cool, very
ribbons.
East. Look at that, very cool.
Yeah, because
The
we all know that we
volcanic
celebrating Yostra, right?
pagan
What
goddess.
what crap. Weird kind of Haniwa position, and there seems to be no consensus on, what this means or why. But but Haniwa showed up in tons of things. He's in, yeah, he's all of them are like this. I don't because they call them the dancers, the Haniwa dancers,
Yeah.
because they're different Haniwa, but the dancers are all like this. And see, he's got his one up, one down, and seems to be no.
Even that's even dancing I can do.
Yeah,
I might adopt that for all my TikToks now.
I know you're British and have no idea how to dance, but that's
No, we don't do dancing or emotions
you
or
say that
personalities.
as
Personalities are for other people.
that's what I'm saying. That's great. Personalities happen to everyone else.
Yes.
That's how I started this book, the riddle book, which is life happens to most people, but Bindle Plottisteer happens to everybody else. So yeah, I like that. Personalities happen to other people. I'm going to use that one now. Fantastic. Welcome everyone to another very special Legends and Lectures. We're back with Howard Williams, and we're here to talk about the history and future of the D word that YouTube doesn't like.
The unalivement of humanity through the inevitability of our mortality.
Oh, wonderfully said, Howard. Absolutely 10 on 10. For those who did not see you on your last appearances, please tell everybody who you are, what you do, and what you specialize in.
I really don't know anymore, but I think my name used to be Professor Howard Williams, and I am a professor of archaeology and I research the archaeology of death, burial, and commemoration, and also the heritage and public archaeology. So, uh, death in the human past, how people dealt with the dead, and how it matters today.
Smashing. Wonderful. I think that in order to understand the future of mortuary practices, because everybody seems to be okay with that word mort in many in many facets, let's talk about what's been done in the past. I think lots of
Yeah,
people like to point to weird burial practices or weird cremation practices or weird flesh stripping practices, which I always think
yeah.
are really interesting. But what do we know? What can we say about how some of the earliest people that we know have treated their dead? How did they bury or cremate their
Yeah.
remains?
So, I mean, archaeology is the only subject that can give us that massively deep time story about our life and our death. And we're pushing back not only the archaeological evidence of stone tool use and other tool use, fire, and all these other sort of check box indicators of modern humanity back hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years, but we're also pushing back evidence earlier and earlier. We're finding evidence of people pre-modern, non-anatomically modern Homo sapiens before, disposing of the dead. So there's a whole debate about Neanderthals burying the dead. We've got evidence. There's a debate about Homo naledi, which is ongoing. I remain very skeptical, but it's a really important debate to be having about whether this Southern African diminutive hominid, several 100,000 years ago, were deliberately taking their dead into recesses of caves, in whole or as body parts, and caching them into places and into the floor surfaces. And we now have evidence of our anatomically modern Homo sapiens have been disposing of the dead at least 190 to 100,000 years ago in the Levant. And so we are seeing multiple past hominin species were doing things with the dead other than just going, oh, look, he's gone now. Let's just leave him here, you know, which is kind of my attitude to most people around me, really. Oh, he stopped answering emails, well, it must be,
Oh,
but
that's
no, but
George
seriously,
then.
yeah. So we got evidence that this is an integral part of humanity, and just to give you, we tend to assume still a lot of scholars would tend to believe that the earliest evidence is simple, it's burial. I would flip that around and say the earliest evidence we have that's categorically deliberate burial is the easiest way to spot the disposal of the dead. It doesn't mean that people weren't doing more elaborate procedures, multiple stage disposal. And indeed, there's an amazing new study that came out last year on smoked mummification in
Yeah.
Southeast Asia and Australia that pushes it back, over 10, 12,000 years. I can't remember off the top of my head. But in other words, the evidence that people are deliberately treating, planning to treat, as they would with any other material they needed to preserve, smoking the dead, putting the dead over a fire to make sure they don't rot. And these are surely more difficult to spot in the archaeological record, but I think it makes the point that we're getting evidence of elaborate procedures much earlier. So we've got the oldest evidence for cremation in Africa now, going back at 9,000 BP. So we're pushing it back even further in different places. I think the earliest evidence in the Americas of cremation is Alaska, about 11,000 BP. So we as soon as people started being us, they started dealing with the dead in elaborate ways. And so archaeologists can chart that story all the way through ancient complex societies and right up to the modern world. And part of our remit as archaeologists of death is looking at our deathways, how I hate to use the word Western, but global North, or which we say globalized modernity, has commercialized, has dealt with massive population expansion, urbanization, and how different material cultures, spaces, cemeteries, and disposal methods have adapted. And it's not always driven by utility, but utility and spirituality all interact in complex ways. Death is about society, economy, politics, religion, everything in between and around. And so all I can say is it's the subject of many books and many studies, but there's no single way of disposing of the dead. There's no simple primitive method. As early as we can chart it, people have clearly got different ideas, even in the same communities, about how and when and where to dispose of the dead. And that's the cool thing about humans is we make shit up. We're
Hmm.
always adapting and changing our minds based on a whole range of criteria. And that's in many ways, while there are many things that are odd about the past, very different, we don't tend to, in the middle of a Canadian street or in a British field, starts hacking up art bodies for vultures to eat or something. But there are certain common things that we tend not to do at the moment in the West, but we do tend to do a lot of other things, and burial, cremation, um, um, and cremation then burial. Burial, then exhumation and reburial. There's so many different ways in which we dispose of the dead we can chart over time.
Yeah, there's even things like in Maze How, or was it the red lady or red person now? I guess because it wasn't a red lady, in fact, where they dyed the bones with red ochre and kept them in the
Yeah,
cave in
ochre is a
Wales.
big phenomenon from the Paleolithic onwards. Yes, so we have the Pavilan Cave, Red Lady, that's a man, but they called it a Red Lady because they thought it was a Roman prostitute when they first excavated the body, because that's what, yeah, so you have that's a Gravettian burial, if I remember rightly. But yeah, no, through time, the different ways of treating the body, caring for the dead, and we can't we can't get into people's minds and do some kind of touchy feeling. Oh, it must have been sad, and it probably won't. But we can say that people have always cared for each other and cared about what happens to the dead, and not everyone gets the same treatment. And that's the other great truth is that everyone's death comes to everyone, but it isn't felt or experienced or doesn't impact on society equally. And so we see the origins of inequality in the treatment of the dead too, very early on. Some people were special, and not necessarily because they were high status or particularly liked. It may be a whole series of complex circumstances and significances as to why certain people were given elaborate treatments and others not.
Yeah, I hate to mention the S word, but Stonehenge is a very good example of that.
Yeah,
Where you
yeah,
just go, why were these people, or even Avebury, right? The Avebury Archer.
yeah,
You just go, why was this person special? Maybe we don't really know. They were buried with
yeah.
special things like an anvil and very cool things, but w was that person a blacksmith? Was
Yes,
we,
yeah. So you have these kind of like a lot of the objects we place with the dead are not always about their personal identity, but maybe about broader connections and stories that people wanted to tell. And it doesn't mean that the dead person's arbitrary, but people are wrapping stories through the ritual. I mean, ritual is all about storytelling, just as archaeology is about storytelling. And the rituals people conduct at gravesites are ways in which people were trying to make sense of their loss in relation to bigger stories. And sometimes the person is important, but they're important for reasons that they would perhaps, if they had a choice and they were the only people directing their own funeral, would perhaps not wish to, highlight or emphasize. There's a League of Gentlemen comedy scene where the granddad is in his coffin, and of course you realise he's still alive, and he's setting them all up for rehearsal of his own funeral, and it's like dark, weird humour, but it does make the point that the person who's dead is the last person who's going to have the final say on what happens. It's always about a dialogue between what the dead is thought to have wanted to happen and what the living decide based on all manner of political, economic, cultural, social, and religious motivations.
yeah, and even now, in today's day where people are becoming, in certain aspects, less religious, are mortuary practices actually always tied to religious rites? Well, not necessarily, but
No.
especially nowadays, it's changing a lot. And even people like my neighbor, who when she buried her mom at 105 years old, her mom wanted a funeral dirge, she wanted a procession, and she just went, nope.
Yeah,
And that was,
exactly.
yeah.
And we've had the pressure of the pandemic, the last pandemic, which forced a lot of people who had to deal with loss into decisions they didn't want. But often, even when there isn't a pandemic, there's economic constrictions,
Hmm.
there's economic opportunities, because in a capitalist society, people are trying to sell you death in a variety of different elaborate forms that you can pay after and pay. It's an expensive, it's one of the few industries that's always going to be making money, and it's always becoming more expensive. And the cost of funerals is on the rise. Yeah, we live in a society where we've seen massive transformations in where and how people are being disposed of in since the 19th century, with the rise of a medicalization where people are dying in hospital, secularization where the church no longer have full control, and industrialization, and urbanization, all these izations. Our society has changed so fundamentally that we see shifts and major fundamental changes in what's happening to the dead. And that's part of the archaeological study. We overlap with historians and anthropologists in studying the deathways of recent centuries. So that's one of my sidelines I'm less well known for, is doing some research on modern deathways and the material cultures, because while historians may focus on some of the written records and the parish records or the cemetery records or the landscape design aspects, geographers and anthropologists and others will look at how people experience grief and deal with death. Archaeologists can just look at the material data. We're not digging up people's fresh graves, but what we are doing is observing patterns in the material practices of what people do, the flowers they leave, the choices of design of cemetery space. And so archaeologists are one of the many disciplines looking at our deathways in that deep time perspective.
That's actually been a question here, which is, since we are quote unquote running out of space,
Yeah.
they've asked, well, at what point does a burial become archaeology? So what do you think, Howard?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a legal. It varies country to country because you often lease. Usually, you lease your grave, and so archaeology is. There's different ways of defining this. Some people use that as just a think they think it's a clever question when it's actually quite a dumb question, because archaeology. But I'm not saying you're dumb, but I'm just saying it depends on how you think about what archaeology is.
Yes.
So archaeology is the investigation of human societies through their material culture. So even before you're dead, you're archaeology in one sense, and
Oh,
the stuff
yes.
you left behind last year is archaeology. And your grave, as soon as it's dug and or as soon as any memorial is put up, is archaeology. But we're not. It's not archaeology in the sense of it's fair game to remove your remains without permission. Archaeology is all about ethical, legally sanctioned, socially recognized, and responsible research. And so it becomes archaeology when it's done by archaeologists who have the skills, the training, the questions to investigate with established and replicable methods. Data sets in a systematic and fair and responsible way. So, in many ways, the modern dead are not archaeology because we're not disturbing those remains, but they are still archaeology in terms they are material, observable traces that tell us a story about our history. So there's not a moment. What I'm answering is actually that there is simultaneously a Schrodinger's archaeology with the dead is that you are not archaeology and you are archaeology, depending on how you frame it. So, as a fresh, if I go to a modern cemetery and see fresh burials, they are simultaneously definitely part of the archaeological story of that landscape, a story that may have begun in the Bronze Age or in the Middle Ages or in the 19th century. And those new additions are part of the culturally, socially significant connections of people to that place. So they are part of the archaeological story, but simultaneously, we're not digging them up.
Yes. Mark, when we had on Dr. Smitty Nathan, she had asked, what is an artifact? What do you think is an artifact? And Mark, being the resident archaeologist, said, actually, he said, I would say anything that you can see and touch is an artifact. Because if it is a thing that has been touched by cultural and human hands, it becomes an artifact. Is it an artifact it's gonna be in a museum tomorrow? Probably not, but it is still something that you've interacted with in your life and it has meaning and therefore it's an artifact. And I think it's pretty much it's the same considering as you said with archaeology. We are archaeology as we are living beings in a cultural landscape. And when we die, we do become archaeology, which I think is quite nice. I would love to become archaeology, to be honest with you. I'd love to be useful to future students. But
Yeah. So, I mean,
we
yeah, go on.
go ahead, go ahead.
No, I mean, so we're as archaeologists, we are have tended traditionally to define our discipline as studying the deep time story of prehistoric, ancient, medieval, historic, as in up to the 19th century grace. There's a lot of really important work done in colonial societies, North America, for example, looking at cemeteries, the treatment of enslaved people, the treatment of, of different social categories, different religious denominations. So archaeology has long established itself going up to the end of the 19th century, but increasingly there's been work done in European cities and churchyards in when we have to investigate and conserve crypts. Every piece of conservation work done in a historic church or churchyard, cemetery, we are disturbing sometimes graves of the 1920s, 1940s. And in rare cases, there have been cases where, obviously in forensic context, where we're disturbing recent graves to investigate crimes. Um, so there are many ways in which our methods are applicable to the 20th century. But in terms of surface survey, and that's why I'm trying to make the distinction to absolutely crystal clear to anyone listening to this and getting outraged, is that in terms of surface survey, as soon as you're in the ground, you're archaeology because you are contributing to the story of that place, not in a way that we're going to start scrutinizing or passing personal judgments on your choice of bad spelling or choice of motif on your grave or whatever. I'm joking, but
But even
seriously, it
not in the
happens.
ground. I mean, if let's say I were cremated and then put in an
Yeah,
urn and then put on the shelf,
yeah.
I'm
So
there.
doesn't happen much in the UK on the shelf, but we there are many European and other places where columbaria where you're above ground in the
Hmm.
cemetery space, but also at home. So your cremated remains as part of lived space. No one's going to be barging into your house, doing a sort of SWAT team sort of or ice raid, give us your dead, freeze, but we
Bring
are
out your dead. Bring
yes,
out your...
but yeah, but there are genuine questions about domestic space in the 20th century that archaeologists have been doing work on recently, abandoned spaces, and the dead are part of that story. There's no space, despite us saying we have designated spaces for burials, everywhere in our landscape has some connection to the dead. And that's one of the themes of the last century is the rise of cremation
Hmm.
as a big movement that began in the late 19th century, spread worldwide, inspired by many different motivations, medical, sanitation, but also nonconformism and inspirations from the ancient world and the Orient, using the British, the Orient, the East, the South Asia, East Asia. Um, Rise of cremation as a solution for urban cremation, but also many other factors and motivations. Then the post Second World War, particularly 1960s, 70s, woodland, green, natural burial movement
Hmm.
sees the development of sort of woodland space or farmland space away from the traditional cemetery space. That's been another second wave of 20th century change, and broader three other factors that I think are important to bear in mind that are nothing to do with the grave itself. Firstly, there's cenotaphisation. It's a term that I've seen used by a number of sociologists and historic geographers, the memorialization away from the grave. So we've seen that almost every part of our landscape, from football grounds to um, seasides to historic monuments, can be and is used for the scattering of ashes of pets and loved ones, but also for memorials. So park benches,
Hmm.
seaside benches, benches are everywhere. Memorialization, and then on the top of that, in the last 40 to 50 years, the digitization of death and the rise of the internet, people wanting digital spaces, digital memorials, digital, and basically we have whole social media platforms. Mainly, the only people living on them are bots, Zuckerberg, and the dead. That's basically what Facebook is. It's like a massive, massive
It's
death
becoming
platform
as
now.
they say, a digital graveyard
Yeah,
because they, after
yeah,
you die, they don't shut down your account. And
no,
so they leave it up. They say that they will take it down if the person's family provides evidence and then they'll delete it for them. But many people actually leave them up. So this way, if there's a birthday or something that comes around, people write messages saying thinking of you or remembering you, that kind of thing. And it is becoming a digital graveyard.
yeah.
Absolutely.
And the final one I just wanted to put out there is, in terms of material culture and spaces, a lot of people's mourning and connection is with morbid culture online and in entertainment media. So video gaming, favorite TV shows, the loss and death of, and this has feedback into the real world with fictional grave locations. But it's a widespread phenomenon that people are mediating mortality through a morbid culture of mourning the loss of fictional characters.
Yeah, people
So
might think that this is odd, but I mean, we have Robin Hood's grave and we know he's not buried there, but he's certainly a
yeah,
fictional character.
definitely a fictional character. But you get people very angry about that if you say that. But no, yes, and so you have this whole. And I suppose if I was going to add a sixth thing to that, and I should have said this before, I put this in my notes. I'm just adding it for my own benefit. Is the relationship of humans and animals has changed? And while there are deep time indications and traces of human l- memorials to pets and animals generally, there's also a vast, international phenomenon of pet cemeteries, and our relationships with animals has been such an important part of how we mediate death. So all of these come together. These are all strands in a broader how our death culture has deep roots. We find evidence of people burying pets thousands of years ago, but so it's not as if this is all a new invention. Cremation isn't new, but the rise of modern cremation is a distinctive phenomenon. Likewise, burying people in farmyards and near settlements is nothing new, but the natural green woodland cemetery phenomenon is a distinctive iteration. Sedimentization isn't new. People lost at sea, people buried far away and memorialized at home goes back to the ancient world and before. But I'm talking about the specific 20th, 21st century phenomenon, and digitizing the dead. And morbid culture isn't new. Having stories that mediate how you think about death and the dead. But all of these are nothing new, and that's what archaeology can show, the deep time story. But we see these themes pushing through as really important at least from my archaeological perspective. I haven't got a thesis on this. I'm just sort of thinking of thoughts in a thinking way
It's
with my
interesting that you
mind.
say that about the benches because I have one outside to a lady named Mary Stark. I have no idea who Mary is, but it's in memorial of Mary Stark, and so I know who this person's name just because somebody made a memorial bench for her. Do I know that her ashes are part of the making of that bench? That I don't know, but everybody sits on it every day, so, so I hope
It
not.
it 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 it's it's fascinating, isn't it? Because we participate in other people's mourning, and that's the
Yes.
thing about benches and cenotaphs, trees,
Hmm.
um, statues, and this is why they're sometimes contentious if they're political figures, because some people get very angry, and rightly so, when they're forced to participate in the public recognition of some particularly odious people. But also, people rarely get so angry about just a bench with a name on it. But it's part of a spectrum of ways in which we're interacting with other people's mourning all the time. Whether it's in sporting contexts, in parks, in railway stations or bus stations. There's always memorialization.
It's interesting that
Um,
you say that because here what's becoming popular is to have your ashes put inside of a one of those earth urns, I guess, I suppose,
yeah,
and put under a tree. And they're
yeah,
doing this because at least the laws here in Canada state that if you have remains and you know there are remains there in a public space, you cannot sell that property to be lived on. And so a lot of people are asking
so it's
their
protection.
yeah, exactly. And so a lot of people
It's
are
like
asking,
newts.
it does. It
I don't know
actually,
about you know that, but the whole conservation, you've got to protect the newts. If you can find newts on a piece of ground, then they can't build houses on it. It's I'm simplifying massively, but it's the whole, conservation. You protect the land through something that legally they can't remove. Yeah,
so people are, in the park where I live, they do have remains under some trees and around the trees that are many of them are about 200 years old. They have a little plaque, obviously not planted into the tree, but like a necklace around the tree, and where it says whose remains are under that tree. And for 30, I think it's 30 yards around is the current legislation. You cannot build any building on top of it. And so a lot of people are doing that in order to protect national parks and make sure that they're there for as long as the law exists. And I think that's pretty interesting. And if you want to, you can go see that person who's part of a tree, and just enjoy their presence and thank them for saving the apple trees that are right beside our house. So I think it's interesting that people are, as you say, nothing is new, but people are really thinking about it. I think also people have misconceptions about how certain people chose to deal with their dead, especially things like Vikings, where people think, oh, everybody had the boat on fire. And you just go, no, they did not have the boat
no,
on fire.
no, and the thing is, there's many misconceptions about cremation as my particular fascination as the modern world, because cremation, you can have woodland burial of an inhumed body or a cremated body, is the kind of example you're talking about. Cremation is often seen as utilitarian. It does facilitate the transportation, reduction of size. You can incorporate many more cremations into a space. It is space related. It is driven by utility, but it's also can be incredibly spiritual and it's been a practice around from since long before, and the need for space to drive the reduction of the body. So you can say, oh well, they only cremated to stop dogs from it or wolves from eating the body. There's all sorts of ways you can create a practical explanation for why people do it. But at the end of the day, these are choices that allow affordances, allow opportunities. They have material agency to allow you to do things with the dead. So by cremating a body, you shut down some options and you open up other options of where and how you can dispose of the dead. And for me, in the modern context, yes, it is to do with space, and that's why there are legislations in places like Japan. Hong Kong tradition historically, where pushing people to cremation, or it needs to be institutionalized or legally driven, because there's no bleeding space to do anything else. But there's still creativity and optionality in where, how precisely, depending on economy and wealth, and other factors, you dispose of the dead. And so for me, it's cremation is all, and the other disposal methods. It's all about, yeah, there are genuine practical and economic factors, but there are also many ways in which people decide to make idiosyncratic expressions. Even in a very formalized space, you can find idiosyncratic spaces. And so for me, modernity is, there's no single death way in modern times, but there are a series of overlapping themes, and people are adapting this and taking on very different strategies. And so, I'm fascinated by modern crematoria because not only can you in some of them see a hundred. 150 sometimes years of story of developing deathways, but you also see the great individuality that people are able to articulate in relatively modest or reduced spaces. So yeah, I'm fascinated by that and that those trends, and I've done some publications about that. But I'm also interested um, in some of the new ways of disposing of the dead, which I haven't really researched, but I'm just fascinated about what comes next with them. But yeah,
And so where do you think we're going, Howard? Do you think now we'll have more crematoria in space?
yeah, yeah, okay, okay. So yeah, I mean, So there's been various attempts to make more ecologically friendly because cremation isn't ecologically friendly, really. It's a lot, it evaporates a lot of heavy metals into the atmosphere. They put filters on the crematoria, but a lot of it's hardly a ecologically sound way of disposal. And there's been various initiatives adopted. So the biggest one is alkaline hydrolysis. Has been given various trade names such as resomation, aquamation. I won't go through the biochemistry of it because I don't really understand the details. But the idea is it's a chemical way of reducing the body, and then and this is taken off in a small way. But it's yet to become mainstream. You've also got composting. Terramation is one of the trade names of ways you can basically create the conditions where rapid reduction of decomposition takes place in a very controlled way. And there's also fungal versions of it. I don't know if there's a
Ooh,
trade name for this sort of. I'm just going to make it up and say rhizomation. But the idea if you can introduce fungi to the body that particularly will break down the body in a very
I
rapid
want to be
way.
a mushroom host. That sounds
Yeah,
great.
yeah. I don't know. I feel already infected by various different fungal infect. No, no, I'm joking. I feel eaten alive from the inside and out by bacteria and fungi all the time. I'm getting old. I'm melting. I'm melting. No, but but seriously, we're all dead already, just waiting to go. But I mean, I feel there's a rat gnawing on my leg at the moment. No, but no, but no, seriously, the fungi can have me. As long as but I prefer to go flames. I want the flames to take me, but I want to better to burn out than to fade away, as Clancy Brown once said in a certain film. Um, but anyway, with I digress. I don't know how we got onto Highlander, but anyway,
It's
yeah.
always
So
there in
there's
the back of your mind because there can be only one.
there can be only one, and there's only one way to dispose of yourself. So alkaline hydrolysis and compostation, or fungalization, or rhizomation, or whatever. These have been suggested as new innovations, but for me, um, they're not that interesting. And they're not that interesting because at the end of the day, they'll lead to a very similar reduction to cremation. So I suspect, and this is a very hyper conservative, small c way of looking at it, I think that however rapidly those become adopted, and the advantage might be that they're seen as less offensive to particular religious groups who have tended to see cremation as offensive. But I'm not up to date with all the debates there. But I wonder whether some of those methods might be a way round some groups, particularly Muslims, Jews, who have tended to, and Catholics, though cremation is legal and sanctioned by the Catholic Church, but there's a traditional cultural reticence. I wonder whether some of these new methods might be seen as amenable to those groups or not. I don't know. But I think overall, it'll make no difference because the overall trend is towards cremation like reduced bodies and what we do with them. Other methods are available, burial at sea, but we've got a massive pollution problem anyway. I doubt that will be acceptable on a global scale with plastic pollution, but also do we want corpses floating around? Or burial in rivers. I don't see that coming back in a modern world. Excarnation, I can't see happening. Zoroastrian sky burials, Parsis. No, I can't see that being taken on. I want to feed the crows, but I don't think we could do it on a mass scale required in a hygienic and sanitary way in a modern environment. I
They still
can't
do
see
it.
how.
Zoroastrians, they still take the bodies up to the mountains and
Yeah,
let
yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah. And I'm not passing judgment on that. I'm saying that I can't imagine a in the middle of New York City or in the middle of sort of Coventry or wherever it may be, people setting up towers and
Uh,
having,
mm.
thousands of pigeons and then as well as the fact they'll be pooing everywhere and bits of body falling off, I can't see it being amenable. And even if they're in the countryside, on top of a Welsh mountain, wind farm, pile of corpses. I really don't see that taking on. So I think we're left. I don't think cryogenics just freezes things down and doesn't do anything. Open air cremation, even more environmentally problematic. Space, it's too expensive. I mean, most of the stuff
Well, but
going
what
into
if we build
space.
a cannon though and just shoot? to shoot
Like,
you up.
today's fire will take 1,000 people into. I mean, it's possible. I mean, I think it's just for the rich and the stupid, isn't it? It's just for the Shatners and the Bezoses and the people who want to go up in large phallic rockets into near space and go, oh look, it's big and it makes me feel humble for a second. Let's go back and make more
No,
money.
but you
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 know,
know what
I
you do? You need to put all the ashes together in a little cannonball, and you just need to make one cannon that will break the Earth's gravity and just shoot it all the way up and
Well, I think
and
there's
let it
other
keep
options. I
going.
mean, I think Hawaii and Iceland should take on the global vulcanization
Ooh, I
industry.
want that.
I think I want to
Yes.
join the lava. I mean, I think there's there. I mean, I again, I really don't think that taking on because, of course, active volcanoes are dangerous places, and you know, I can set up a kind of imagine a Mustafar type sort of Sith Lord structure of a creation where they sort of put the bodies over, you know, sort of
But
a
we need a
lava
conveyor
floor.
belt that goes up the
Yeah.
flow, and then you just
As long as
you
there's
stick.
the ominous Sith music going, ooh, ooh,
But you're
how
at the
many bodies
bottom.
have we disposed of today, my apprentice? You know, that type of thing. No, but I don't think that's going to happen. I'm being silly here, but you know, but so I
But I
think
think
it's going
that's
to
a
come
great
down.
idea. I would love that to have a conveyor belt at the bottom of a volcano. I mean, Fujisan is not active, but I would love if he were active. I would love for them to put because you can walk up him, and so I would love if they had a conveyor belt at the bottom and they just wrapped you up really nice, and then they just very slow, yeah, exactly, just the slow ascent,
Cable cars for
and
the
then
next world.
yeah, and
Yeah,
you
or
just
yeah,
go
no,
in.
I think, but what I'm trying to say is, in all reality, we're looking at variants on cremation or rapid reduction methods as the future. Um, but for me, that's not a future that's dire or dismal for the dead because I think there will still be lots of options of how we digitally, cenotaphically, in other words, away from the place of disposal, and um, also many ways in which those actual places of burial might be developed. So I think the future is versions of rapid reduction ization, different terms we use. And the question is, therefore, how do we contribute to thinking about how do archaeologists contribute to thinking about what do they look like? Where do we get the inspiration for those ideas? Caves, architectures, uh, you know, three-dimensional landscape features, walls of memory. There's so many options that a modern crematorium offers. Uh, um, ponds, bird baths, what do you call them? Bird feeders and rose bushes and there's already a plethora, if that's a word. Yes, it is,
Yes, it is.
of different choices of, of how to integrate ashes or reduced. I'm trying to use a sort of general rapid reduced body transformation into those garden open air spaces and structures. So I think the question is, what kind of architectures do we want? What kind of landscape designs do we want for the dead? And where do we want them? And do we want to continue with the idea of a cemetery, or do we want to continue with the idea of farmland, woodland, or do we want different versions? We want playground disposal areas. Do we want roundabouts to become, you know, do we want more public spaces where you can catch your train and also there's a memorial garden where that's where your loved ones are? I don't know. I think there's a lot there's real healthy conversations to be had here about breaking up the cemetery as it is currently and thinking about whether we can separate the place where you actually reduce the bodies and then where you memorialize the bodies and where you know, there's so many options. And I think it's going to be interesting to see where those develop.
Bring back bog bodies. Bring back bog
And
bodies.
now, actually, yeah. So, I mean, was assuming on a massive scale, bogs, sea, water lakes is not a good idea for sanitation and nature. But you know, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the bog is the way to go. But given we're decimating bogs, and you know, they've been destroyed, so much bogland and wetland has been destroyed. You know, maybe that's a way of protecting them, like you say with the trees. You know, if you put the bodies in, but if you put the bodies in, then that's a way of you know, but I think wet places and open air burning are just like really not gonna, or exposure of the bodies, I don't think are gonna go down
The
well.
humic acid will save us, Howard.
Yeah, yes. But I do think that these are, I mean, even if they're couched in fun ways, these are conversations we should be having. We should be looking to the past and looking to bog bodies of Iron Age Northern Europe and thinking, okay, those people may have been unalived against their will, but
Well, but were
maybe
they,
there
Howard?
are.
Because were they? Because Lindo Mann now says no.
I disagree, but I think he was definitely asking for it.
That's
No,
good.
I'm joking. I don't know the details of all of these individual bug boilers, but the fact is, um, they may not have been typical disposal methods of their time, but can they provide the focus of a conversation that informs our future? And that's the point, isn't it? It's that by the more we learn about death in the past and get away from simply mummies and bog bodies as the stereotypes, the more we look at the diversity of disposal methods, the more it can actually free up those conversations and get people thinking about, well, why don't we try this or why don't we try something different and see what people do? I mean, when you look back to the 19th century, a lot of the major developments of Neo-Egyptian architecture, catacombs, were never popular. People wanted to be under the ground, not above the ground. And that's really interesting, is that what people design and what people actually then take up doesn't always map up, no, it doesn't always match. And that's true with any society when you give people a choice. So what we need to do is to perhaps encourage the funerary industry, encourage our legislators, encourage our public policy people to think outside the coffin, outside the box.
Oh.
To think of other, how we can use the archaeological record to sort of liberate us from some of our constricted thinking. And so, I don't know. Those are my thoughts.
Howard, can you tell people where they can find your books on unaliving and cremations,
How to make your
please?
own day. So I've done this. If you go to my Archaeo Death WordPress blog, all my publications are listed there. I've done a series of edited collections, which include chapters on 19th to 20th century death, and I've got individual journal articles and so on. I haven't got a big book on modern death myself yet, although I do want to write one day. But I do think if I have time and energy, I will be writing a book on the archaeology of contemporary and future death. But because I always talk to my students about, just to wrap up a point, rather than just say go to my blog is the best place to start. Um, by every time we go to a cemetery, I tell them, look at what's here, look at the past, look at how the cemetery is developed, look at the different phasing, and you can see the 1890s graves and the 1950s graves, and then always look at the spaces they're planning. And so a lot of the local crematoria near me and cemeteries, you can see how they're planning for the future. They're planning for the next 50 to 100 years. And so we see in the present the planning for the future. And that's the way we study the future, is by looking at how those spaces are set up. They're latent future archaeology spaces, mortuary archaeology. Look at how they're designed and envisaged, how these spaces does, the plan set up, but also how we can contribute as archaeologists by drawing on the past to suggest new spaces, new architectures, new material culture we might adopt. So we can going back to the past can inspire future disposal methods.
So, Howard, when is your book on mortuary practices coming out?
Well, it'll be out next week. No, AI will be writing it now. No, I don't know.
No.
I don't know.
That's
I've got
interesting that you say that because there is a big, great debate now about AI memorials. And I have seen one of my students was talking about this, and I have seen that there are some, obviously, I think it's unethical, but there are some people who want AI representations of their dead, which are obviously not true representations. But they are allowable in some funerary practices, which I think is very interesting.
You see, I still have many problems with AI, and I find it very disturbing that people are sort of what's the word? Giving up, handing over some
Yeah,
of
I
the
mean,
basic
part of
elements
part
of
of the
humanity.
the cultural aspect of death is
Yeah.
also the grieving process, the
Yeah,
togetherness of the
eulogies being
community.
written, best man
Right.
speeches being written by AI, whatever it may be, it feels I find that threatening to my sense of the way there is, but I have to accept it as part of what's going on. All I would say is that I'm aware that everything I do online is being part of will be part of a generated synopsis where AI will take some middle ground between opposing views about my work and other people's academic work, or every time I sneeze, or I do worry about how my own story will be told, won't be told by people, it'll be told by some AI synopsis. And that does upset me, but I suppose it doesn't upset me too much because that would presume I actually give a flying fart what people think anyway. But I suppose the point is, it saddens me when people are reduced to simply. But then I have to think from another perspective, aren't all memorials selective tellings of a synopsis? Even the most detailed 18th century biography in a grand church monument is all about how he was the most distinguished public servant, the most beloved, loving father, dedicated husband, and loyal to the king, and these things. And probably he was just another sponging, brandy sucking toff who just sat around in some colonial position for 60 years, bothering the locals and causing misery. But so isn't that always what we've isn't that absolutely symptomatic of what we've always done? We're just handing it over to AI to do that work. Sorry, that's just some thoughts.
And on that depressing note, thank you, Howard, for being. No, always a pleasure to be depressed and talking about
We are the
the
Walking Dead.
we are. I mean, in the Sylvia Plath sense of the word, we are. We are born to die. That is the nature of everybody, and that's why it is so universal. It's very interesting to talk about what the future of more trade practices will be, because we are getting away from things like religious institutions, or there are new religious institutions, and people are deciding new things for themselves. And it is interesting to see that culture is now, whereas you would say like, oh, the Viking culture was to do this, or the Jomon culture was to do this. We don't really have that one culture anymore. Now it's kind of like this individual wish and global practice of what people want for themselves, which is very interesting. So I certainly think it is. Thank you, Howard, so much for being here. And next time we'll talk about your book on, on the future of
Yes, which
mortuary
will be written
practice.
in 24 hours. I
I
shall
look,
train some rats and some fungi to write it for me, not the AI. The AI.
you'd probably get a better result that way.
Follow ArchaeoDeath on WordPress, or you'll never learn.